It's been so discouraging to make long videos now that the shorts got a lot more views than the long ones I made. But I guess not all the topics I want to discuss could be shared as the short form. Especially now that I want to share the story where it involved young individuals, both the perpetrators and victims. In this video, we briefly talked about how being super into the underworld can have some seriously negative effects on teenagers. Today, I want to delve deeper in this topic by telling you about a really terrible case that shows just how brutal and ruthless teenager gang activity could be. Today's case happened in Hong Kong. I have a hard time pronouncing names in Cantonese, so I will use Mandarin for the names. Bear with me. And I'm sure it is going to be very disturbing to even listen to this case. If you're finding this too much to watch, feel free to click away whenever you want. So without further ado, let's turn back time and go to Hong Kong in the 1980s. Hong Kong in the 80s. It was the place to be if you wanted to make it rich. Hong Kong was one of the hottest financial centers in all of Asia and the world. They had it all: a strong finance system, free trade policies, and a chill business environment. And they were all about finance, trade, shipping, and real estate, and had lots of international investors and big companies coming in. Hong Kong was making bank. Per capita income was going up quickly. So back when Hong Kong was still a British colony, things were pretty chill. During the 1980s, Hong Kong attracted a significant number of British and other foreign nationals to work and live there. And foreign pros and big global companies made Hong Kong a base for their Asian HQs or regional offices. The expats made some huge contributions to Hong Kong's economic and culture, and were a big part of making it the international player it is today. So all I'm saying is that Hong Kong lived a lot of foreigners that were mostly doing serious business in Asia. On the morning of the 21st April 1985, the Hong Kong Island English Children's School reported to the police that 2 students had gone missing. The principal told the cops that these 2 kids were from the UK and their parents were working in Hong Kong. The missing student culprit named Kenneth McBride and Nicola Myers. Kenneth was a well-known athlete in the school, while Nicola was one of the popular girls on campus. Kenneth was a member of the school's rowing team. However, he hadn't been able to join the team's recent training sessions because he got his collarbone injured while riding his bike a few days ago. Therefore, he still had bandages on when he was missing. The day before they were reported missing, they first went to watch the rowing team's training. Then they told their classmates that they were leaving the school to go for sightseeing. They were planning on a date to the Victoria Park. However, they did not return to the boarding house that evening, and their classmates assumed they were just staying out, common stuff. However, they failed to show up for class the next day. That was not common anymore, as they weren't these kids that often left class without reasons. So the school naturally would phone their parents to check their whereabouts. And now that everyone was panicked because no one knew where they were, then the school called the police right away. The seriousness of the situation became apparent. The principal clarified that the students' wallets and ID cards were left in their dormitories, and they had only taken some loose change. In China, I guess it's similar in Hong Kong and Macau as well, that you need ID cards to register accommodations and long-distance travels. So this makes it unlikely that they went to Macau or stayed at a hotel. The police assured the school that they would conduct an immediate investigation. While the Hong Kong police were investigating the missing students, a dead body near Victoria Park was reported. Mr. Lam, a local resident who lived nearby and went jogging on Braemar Hill, made the discovery. On the morning of the 21st, at around 6 o'clock, As he was running near the Braemar Hill, which was still a somewhat remote hill at the time, Mr. Lamb noticed something strange. He saw a young man wearing jeans lying on the steep slope of the embankment as if he was sleeping. At such an early hour, with dew covering the entire mountain, who would run into the grass on the hillside to sleep like that? But Mr. Lamb didn't think much at first. He continued running up the hill, and after about an hour, he ran back down and passed by the embankment again. It was at this moment that Mr. Lamb realized that something was seriously wrong. After 1 whole hour, the young man was still lying on the slope without even changing his position. It was bizarre. But still, Mr. Lamb didn't assume the worst. He just worried that he would, roll over, got injured, and tumbling down. So Mr. Lamb thought he was just drunk too much or drugged too much, or he was suffering from a sudden illness. All of the assumptions jumped into his mind though. Mr. Lamb hesitated for a moment, but decided to grip his teeth and check out on him. When he was about 50 meters away from the young man, Mr. Lamb startled. The young man was lying face down on the slope, with his hands tied behind his back. Mr. Lamb shouted from a distance, "Sir? Sir, can I help you?" The young man did not respond. So he naturally walked closer, and Mr. Lamb noticed that the young man had blonde hair, means he could be a foreigner. Summoning his courage, Mr. Lamb approached this foreign young man and called out again. Still no response. The worst assumption finally popped out and overwhelmed Mr. Lamb, as now that he saw it clearly that the guy had his eyes half open, his tongue protruded from his mouth, and his head was covered in blood. Even more horrifying, the guy seemed to have been severely beaten before his death, with numerous bruises and wounds all over his body, particularly on his face and neck. It appeared as though he had been repeatedly struck with a heavy object, almost completely crushing them and rendering his features unrecognizable. Mr. Lamb let out a cry, turned around and started to run. However, the embankment was steep. After a few steps, he lost his balance, fell, and tumbled down for over 10 meters before finally coming to a stop. His face was scraped by the stones, but Mr. Lamb didn't feel the pain. At that time, mobile phone was not yet available, so Mr. Lamb hurriedly ran down the hill to a small store to find a telephone and report the incident to the police. The Hong Kong police took the murder case seriously and quickly arrived at Braemar Hill. Braemar Hill is a mountain peak situated in this north point, which forms part of the eastern mid-levels area of Hong Kong Island. Although Hong Kong is small in size, the eastern mid-level area where Braemar Hill is situated is quite extensive. Before the 1960s, this area was mostly undeveloped and consisted of wild hills and ridges. Over time, it was transformed into upscale residential areas and schools. In the 1980s, though, it was still considered quite remote. Victoria Park is located adjacent to Braemar Hill. It was not secluded at all and was surrounded by several schools. Students often took walks in that park. In contrast, Braemar Hill was desolate and rarely frequented by people, making it an ideal place for couples seeking privacy. When the police arrived at Braemar Hill, guided by Mr. Lamb, they found the body. Blonde-haired young man, barely 20 years old, was unrecognizable. He was wearing blue jeans, and his upper garments were almost torn to shreds. His hands were bound with some form of bondage. The assailant callously removed the bandages and forcefully struck the young man's injured collarbone, causing it to fracture once again. The police gasped in shock as they flipped over the young man's body. The young man was covered in bruises and wounds, particularly on his chest and back, which were torn apart. And from some documents I read, they said it looked like a burst pomegranate. After analyzing the injuries, it became apparent that he had been repeatedly struck with a wooden or tree-like object. The forensic team made a rough calculation and estimated that the young man had been struck with the wooden object at least 100 times, with the assault lasting for over 30 minutes. These over 100 strikes were not light taps akin to a mother disciplining her child, but rather forceful and powerful blows. Subsequently, autopsy findings revealed that, in addition to the previously diagnosed fractured collarbone, the young man had over 10 other fractures throughout his body. Some internal organs were also damaged from the beating. However, it was not the beating that killed him, but strangulation. There were marks on his neck that showed that the rope was wrapped around it super tight, like multiple times. And this rope was actually from the young man himself. It was taken off and used against him. And there's this trace that a wooden thing was really pushing hard on his neck. So basically, his neck bones completely broke. These ones up top by his skull. The forensic concluded that they used a long wooden stick to prompt against the young man's neck, while 2 other individuals repeatedly jumped on it. It's like jumping on a seesaw, except the middle of the seesaw was his neck. I know that sounds incredibly horrible. In this manner, the young man's neck had to withstand the weight of over 200 kilograms from 2 individuals. This cruel act resulted in his death, which was caused by a broken neck and asphyxiation. Obviously, there must have been more than one people had done this to him. And according to the footprints and other physical traces they found at the crime scene, the police believed that there were at least 3 or more assailants involved. Remember we said earlier that the school reported that 2 of their students were missing. Considering that the victim was blonde and had an eye injury of a fractured collarbone, it is reasonable to conclude that he could be Kenneth, the missing student. Kenneth and his girlfriend Nicola were together when they went out, and here it was Kenneth. So what happened to Nicola? It could be imagined that her situation was not likely to be optimistic. During the search of the area, the police discovered Nicola's body in the bushes approximately 200 to 300 meters away from Kenneth. She had even worse than Kenneth. Her body was almost completely naked. The lower body was naked, and the upper body t-shirt was lifted to the head, covering her face. It was apparent that Nicola had experienced sexual assault, and forensic analysis revealed traces of semen. What's more scarier is that Nicola had been sexually abused. The forensic autopsy showed that Nicola had some pretty bad cuts in her vagina, and they found some wood chips and glass fragments in there too. They inhumanly used wooden sticks and glass bottles and repeatedly shoved them hard into her vagina, causing large lacerations. It is commonly thought that Nicola experienced such intense pain that she might have lost consciousness. In addition to being raped and sexually abused, Nicola was beaten to death as well. The forensics team lifted a t-shirt that covered her face, and even they were shocked. Nicola's face was ruined to a shapeless, bloody mess, and her head was smashed out of shape with a wooden stick. Her jaw was smashed to pieces, and her left eyeball was gone. Compared to Kenneth, who was injured in more than 100 places, Nicola's whole body from head to toe was almost without a piece of good skin, with up to more than 500 injuries. And the forensic examiners believed that Nicola endured torture for at least 1 to 2 hours. According to the autopsy, Nicola was strangled but not killed by strangulation right away. As we said, she could be passed out during this abuse and torture. The assailants thought she was already dead, so they moved her and Kenneth's bodies to this hill and left them there. Nicola regained consciousness after they left, but her severe injuries left her unable to struggle or cry out for help. Because her jaw was smashed, she couldn't make out a sound. So she eventually died from losing too much blood. The crime scene showed cruel marks spanning approximately 10 meters. The forensic examiner said that Nicola probably spent like 3 or 4 hours trying to save herself in her final moments. Even though she was seriously hurt, she could only crawl less than 10 meters before she died. I can't even begin to imagine how painful she must have been and how desperate it was to wait for the final moments to come. The assailants' brutalities were unimaginable. The cops thought that the embankment wasn't where the bad stuff went down, so more like where the bodies got tossed. And some of Kenneth and Nicola's stuff, like clothing, fancy watches, backpacks, and the weapons used in the crime, were gone. Nobody knew where the heck they were. So everyone in Hong Kong was totally freaked out when they heard about how brutal and heinous the case was. And as we said, there were a lot of British people living there. Within moments, major media outlets in Hong Kong and the UK began providing 24-hour coverage of the case. Television stations continuously reported on this development. Naturally, this placed tremendous pressure on the Hong Kong police. Over 600 officers were deployed to scout Braemar Hill for any potential clues. Simultaneously, the officers conducted thorough interviews with all the residents in the hope of acquiring valuable leads. However, the search and interviews yielded no results. None of the locals had seen those two white couples or anyone acting shady, and the search teams on the mountain didn't find anything major. So Braemar Hill was a pretty big place with a lot of trees. It's gonna be tough for just 600 officers to search it all completely. So some people got their act together and started searching, and the cops even busted out the helicopters for a bird's eye view. But let's be real, thinking the helicopters were gonna spot some clothes and bling up on the mountain was pretty far-fetched. I guess they just wanted to show that the police were totally on top of things and being super proactive. And it took them like 3 whole days to finally make a big discovery. Thankfully, one of the officers found some clothes and jewelry in this little grove area. So after checking things out, it was figured that the stuff that belonged to the lady victim, Nicola, were her dress, undies, bra, shoes, cheap bracelets, and an empty backpack. The backpack only contained her personal photos in London, with a small amount of cash missing. But Kenneth's shoes and gold watches were nowhere to be found. Additionally, multiple wooden sticks were found, which appeared to have been snapped off from nearby trees. Blood stains were evident on the sticks, and some blonde hair was discovered as well. They found an empty glass bottle at the scene, but it was all messed up with a broken top and stuff. And there were blood stains, fingerprints, and traces of semen on it too. It appeared that this particular bottle was used to assault Nicola, the female victim. From all the stuff in the grove, they could tell that at least 3 or more people were there before the cops showed up. Following the discovery of the bodies and evidence, the Hong Kong police held serious discussions to determine the situation. Some experienced detectives thought it could be a revenge killing. But Kenneth and Nicola were subjected to sadistic torture, especially Nicola, who was raped, sexually assaulted, and brutally struck over 500 times. If it was just a robbery or sexual assault, Why the heck would someone go and commit murders in such a brutal way? It made no sense, as at the time, Hong Kong was still a British colony, sharing a similar legal system. So rape was totally a big deal and all, but the punishment wasn't usually more than 10 years in jail. On the other hand, if, say, someone murdered someone in Hong Kong, they could get life in prison or even the death penalty. These attackers were totally brutal and seemed like they knew what they were doing. It's hard to believe that they didn't know what would happen, the consequences of murdering. So if they knew about it and still chose to do it with such a cruel manner, they indeed looked like they were seeking revenge. However, it seems like Kenneth or Nicola had no haters, which make it unlikely that they were killed as part of some vengeful plot. Both teenagers and their families just recently moved to Hong Kong from the UK. It's pretty rare for even grown-ups to get so much hate that someone will want to get revenge by killing them in such a way. On the other hand, some detectives were thinking it might have been a robbery or even a sexual assault that went wrong. Not revenge murder at all, as they found that Kenneth's fancy gold watch and his wallet were missing. And even the little bit of the Hong Kong dollars in Nicola's backpack was gone too. If the primary motive was revenge, they wouldn't take the change and left the photos behind. As if there was hate, there was connections. If you killed for revenge, you don't want the police get to know who exactly were the victims, right? So the right way to do was to take away her photos, even if they wanted to make it as a robbery and took away the change. However, a bracelet that belonged to Nicola was left on the ground. It looked fancy though, it didn't really have any values. So apparently, the bad guys knew their jewelry stuff. They must have either been pros in the jewelry business or really experienced crooks. So that also emphasized that the motive for the crime was money, as they took only the valuable stuff. Furthermore, Nicola was raped and sexually assaulted before her death, and the assailants left semen behind. If the killing was just for payback, maybe the attackers wouldn't leave a ton of clues, especially the fingerprints and semens. But both speculations were lack of crucial evidence to support their opinions at the time. The British and Hong Kong media went all out on this case, even showing some pretty gruesome pictures of Nicola's body. This understandably freaked people out in both places, and everyone wanted the criminals caught ASAP. However, the Hong Kong police seemed a little indecisive. They had found semen samples, lots of fingerprints, and what they thought was blood on wooden sticks as well. But back in the 80s, DNA testing wasn't a thing yet, so they could only use the semen and blood to figure out the perpetrator's blood type, but not who they actually were. Luckily, the fingerprints came in handy. But when they checked them against Hong Kong's criminal database, they didn't find any matching information. In that case, these attackers either had no criminal records, or they just simply not from Hong Kong. Also, these people were pretty sleek with avoiding being investigated. The cops couldn't even find where the couple got wrecked and killed, only where the bodies and weapons were dumped. Without that main crime scene, there's some big holes in the evidence. Looks like these dudes knew how to stay off the cops' radar. So the cops did some digging and looked into the families of the victims to see if anyone wanted to cause them harm. But they didn't find anything fishy. No one seemed to have it out for either family. It turns out both families were pretty new to Hong Kong, having only been there for less than a year. The parents were engineers and worked in fields that didn't require them to socialize too much. They didn't seem to have any enemies either, and both victims were pretty well liked at school. They were just starting out in life, so it seems pretty unlikely that anyone would have wanted to cause them harm like that. To be honest, neither of the families had any strong ties to Hong Kong or the local community, so their friends were pretty limited. The police really did try their best, but they couldn't find any solid leads to who could have done it. After a couple of weeks, the cops started to incline that maybe it wasn't a revenge thing after all. Hong Kong and the UK were pretty lit because they had a free media that wasn't afraid to call out the government, especially the police. During that time, the big media outlets in Hong Kong and the UK were going in on the Hong Kong police, saying that they were incompetent and inefficient. The police were so shook, they offered a reward of 50,000 Hong Kong dollars for anyone with information to come forward. But 50,000 Hong Kong dollars wasn't even that much in Hong Kong at that time. In 1980, the premium residential land in the South Bay area of Hong Kong Island was going for 13,500 Hong Kong dollars per square meter. Anyways, the police set up a hotline and are begging for the citizens to snitch if they got any relevant information. The police went to check out over 20,000 peeps living in the surrounding areas, especially near the crime scenes, but didn't find anything helpful. Sadly, it was over 6 months since then, and the case was still at a standstill. So during this time, Kenneth and Nicholas' parents took their children's body back to the UK for burials. It was really sad for the community, as everyone knew that Kenneth and Nicholas were good kids. A lot of people attended their funerals, and there were definitely tears in their eyes. The parents were obviously the most heartbroken. Kenneth's dad was a top executive at a British company in Hong Kong. He was really good at his job and had a great reputation. His bosses really respected him and his skills. After the company expanded in Hong Kong, he was sent to work there as the chief engineer. Even though he knew it would be hard to move his whole family to this new place, he did anyway. Kenneth transferred to a school in Hong Kong. When Kenneth was murdered, his father was so sad that he couldn't work for months. Eventually, he had to quit his job. But his boss was really understanding. He told Kenneth's dad that the company had some responsibility for what had happened. So the company later worked with the police in Hong Kong to offer a bigger reward, 1,500,000 Hong Kong dollars for information about the case. This was certainly not a small sum. It could be used to purchase a house and had the potential to make a significant impact on many people. The influence of money is significant, particularly in Hong Kong at the time. A few days later, a phone call was made to the Organized Crime and Triad Bureau of the Hong Kong Police, commonly known as the Old Unit. The caller said he's like this little boss guy in the Fu Yixing trial, which was a big crime group in Hong Kong in the past. So there was this little gang leader who went up to a cop asking about the reward for intel on this foreign couple's murder. The cop said it was legit and promised to keep it on the down low. The gang leader then said one of their guys, Tan Shihuan, was the one who did it, but the cop wasn't totally convinced and thought the caller could be lying, for the price. So the gang leader had to spill the whole story to the cop. They were all just chilling and having a few drinks when Tan Shihuan started bragging about how he was the one who offed the foreigners that was all over the news. Initially, they thought he was talking nonsense, so they laughed it off. But then he lifted up his foot and showed them that he was wearing the dead guy's Nike shoes. Those kickers were only available in the UK, not in Hong Kong at the time. And the caller's sister worked at a Nike store, so he was always checking out the new styles. As far as he knew, nobody else in Hong Kong had those shoes. So he believed it was true and called the police. When the cops asked why everyone else knew about it, only he was the one who called the police. I mean, gangsters are always short on cash anyway, right? The little gang boss stepped up and explained that he was actually planning to leave the gang and skip town with the reward money. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said a word of it either. You see, among the gang, there's a rule that you never snitch on your fellow members to the police. The consequences for breaking this rule were pretty severe. You could be putting your life on the line. So the little boss guy decided to report the crime, but he really made sure to keep it on the down low with the cops. He didn't want to risk getting whacked just because he wanted to get paid. Thanks for the intel from the small gang leader. The cops started keeping tabs on Tan Shihuan with their undercover agents. So finally, on the 27th of November, after 7 long months of searching, the cops were finally able to catch the guy responsible, Tan Shihuan. Turns out he was just a regular dude from a Hong Kong street gang, and he had a brother named Peng Xin-yi. So these two dudes got involved in the underworld when they were teenagers, but they never really hit the big times. Even though they were in a gang, they were just small-time thugs who followed whatever their bosses told them to do. Peng Xin-yi wasn't happy with that and suggested that they started committing crimes on their own without the support of the gang. But if they got caught, they'd be in big trouble with the gang. So one of the rules for being in the gang was to not get into any trouble outside of the gang activities. They were having a lot of rules, were they, in the past for the gangs. Anyway, they hung out with other young delinquents, or around 20 years old, doing things like extorting and intimidating high schoolers, as well as petty theft. While they were extorting high schoolers, they convinced 2 students, Zhang Youheng and Yin Sanlong, to join them. Zhang Youheng was only 16 years old, when Yin Sanlong was just 15. And you might wonder, why would the students wanted to hang out with those guys from the streets? It's pretty simple. They wanted to get some protection and avoid bullies from other thugs. On that day of Tan Shihuan's arrest, the police searched his home and found a pair of Nike shoes. An investigation confirmed that the shoes belonged to Kenneth. At the same time, the police located a buyer who specialized in purchasing stolen goods from them. A few months prior, Tan Shihuan had sold a branded gold watch to this buyer. The police successfully recovered the watch, which was belonged to Kenneth. Tan Shihuan admitted his involvement in the case, but denied being the mastermind or the killer. Subsequently, Tan Shihuan provided names of the other 4 accomplices. On the day, the police launched operations and successfully arrested Peng Xin-yi, Zhang Weiwen, Zhang Youheng, and Yin Sanlong. So the cops got fingerprints from a glass bottle and some wooden sticks, which confirmed that 2 out of the 5 people were involved in the crime. But when they got arrested, none of them snitched on who was this mastermind, nor gave any details about the crime. The older guys were pros at dodging questions since they've been involved in shady stuff before. They were experienced. The cops started questioning the 2 teenagers who were 15 and 17 years old. Okay, so Zhang Youheng was totally being sneaky and didn't want to help out either. He's the 16. Meanwhile, the youngest member, Yin Sanlong, was scared out of his mind and super confused. The cops quickly tell Yin Sanlong that they had really strong evidence against them. Basically, they were in big trouble, and there was no getting out of it. But since Yin Sanlong was still a kid, he could get a break on his punishment if he cooperated and acted cool. Otherwise, he was looking at a life sentence. So it didn't take long for Yin Sanlong to admit to everything and spill the beans on the crime. According to his account, when they went to Braemar Hill, their main objective was to steal stuff. Their leader, Peng Xin-yi, wasn't making much money in the gang. So the group had to rely on extorting high school students and stealing things to pay their expenses. Because Braemar Hill was pretty secluded, the plan was to steal copper cables installed by the government and sell them to make some cash. But when they reached Braemar Hill in the afternoon, they came across a British couple who were just hanging out and randomly chatting there. At first, they didn't pay much attention to them. However, as they passed by the couple, a ray of sunlight reflected off one of the individual's wristwatch. It was a gold watch. That's when the idea of robbing the couple immediately struck the group. And they saw that the guy had a bandage on, meaning he got hurt before and was weak. They were 5 against a wounded boy and a girl, so they thought they'd win. They didn't bring any weapon, just Peng Xinyi with his barbecue pork. Well, remember, they were just there to steal some cables. So if they were caught with weapons while they were stealing the cables, they'd get into deep troubles. But they couldn't go empty-handed either. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to deal with the security if they come across any. So Peng Xinyi brought his fork, and they pretended that they were there for a barbecue to trick the police, if they encountered any, of course, in case that they were stealing the cables. But then they changed their plans, to rob the couple. So they ran into the woods, shouting and demanding the robbery, and surrounded the couple. The foreigners were scared, but the guy remained a bit calm and spoke some Cantonese. He said they could take their money, and he gave Peng Xinyi his gold watch. Then Peng Xinyi saw that the girl had a bracelet on her wrist, so he asked her to give it to him as well. She did, but the bracelet wasn't worth anything, so Peng Xinyi threw it to the others. He then grabbed over the girl's backpack, but it only had some loose change. Peng Xinyi initially claimed it was just a robbery, but things took a different turn later on. So this dude thought the foreign lady was so pretty, and all of a sudden, some dirty ideas came across his mind. He tried to trick her into the wood with him for a body search, but she was too smart for that and said no way. Peng Xinyi snapped somehow and went full-on violent. He forcibly jacked her. So the guy saw his girlfriend about to get violated. Naturally, he fought back and threw a punch at Peng Xinyi, causing him to stumble. The others saw what was going on and decided to join in, so there were 5 of them against 1. The foreigner was strong, but unfortunately, due to his previous injury, he could only use his left hand, which was not enough to handle all 5 guys. During the fight, the boy told his girlfriend to run away, and she took off right away. Very smart girl. But Peng Xinyi told Tan Shihuan to chase after her, while the remaining 4 of them mercilessly beat up the boy and then tied him up. They couldn't find any rope at the time, so Peng Xinyi dismantled the bandage from that boy. Someone kicked his old injury really hard. That broke his collarbone again, and he was in so much pain that he couldn't fight back anymore. They successfully tied him up. And to make matters worse, the poor girl couldn't run away and got dragged back and assaulted by Peng Xinyi. But when he raped her, the rest of the people were told to guard the injured boy, though they heard screams and saw Peng Xinyi hit her. So when Peng Xinyi came back, he was all like, yo, the girl saw my tattoo, so she had to go. Boyfriend too, After he said that, everyone got shocked and didn't know what to react. No one wanted to take actions and mess with the kind of talk about killing. Peng Xinyi was getting pretty kicked off. He pointed the barbecue fork at his pals and was like, seriously, bro? You just want to bail and leave me to take the blame? We're tied and we're gonna stick together. If anyone does want to play ball, I'll take care of them myself. Got it? Yin Sanlong was like, I didn't want to do it. But then he got forced into it anyway. And the other guys were down for it. One of them even suggested that, just straight up murdering the dude with the barbecue fork. Peng Xinyi was there to call him out on his stupidity, They ended up breaking off some sturdy branches and using them as weapons instead, so they could beat the deer to death. They figured this would make it harder for the police to find evidence. They were in a hill that was full of trees. No one would notice over missing branches. So the 5 of them took turns wailing on the guy with those wooden sticks. Each person hit it more than 20 times, and in total, it was more than 100 strikes. The boy was very strong. Despite being badly injured, he just wouldn't die. Later, Peng Xinyi came up with the idea of strangling him to death. First, they strangled the boy with the bandage, which was still not fatal. Then Peng Xinyi had them place a wooden stake on the neck of the boy, while one person stood on either side and jumped up and down repeatedly. After several jumps, the boy's neck was crushed and soon broke. He died in a miserable way. They tortured him for at least half an hour. After the killing, the underages were terrified, but then the adults didn't take it seriously at all. They jumped up and stepped on the body, heckling it as if they were playing a game. After what they had done to the boy, they thought they were guilty of murder anyway. They went back to deal with the girl. She was tied up and almost naked. They didn't straight up killing her. Instead, they tortured her with smiles on them. They put a wooden stake and glass bottle forcefully and repeatedly inserted into the lower body of that girl. Seeing that she passed out, they finally decided to kill her. So when Yin Sanlong was about to kill the boy, he hesitated and had a weak grip due to the intense fear he experienced, resulting in less forceful actions. Maybe Peng Xinyi was afraid that Yin Sanlong might have second thoughts later, so he had to drag him further into the depths of darkness. He instructed Yin Sanlong to be the first to strike the girl. Yin Sanlong had no other choice but to reluctantly raise the wooden stake and swing it down with his eyes closed. While he aimed to her head and was supposed to give her the fatal strike, but since he had his eyes closed, he hit with an angle and caused the girl's eye got out of the socket. Yin Sanlong got terrified, so the wooden stick fell out of his hands after the blow. Peng Xinyi wouldn't just leave him easy on it, so he picked up the stick and forced Yin Sanlong to continue his attack. Yin Sanlong said he had to keep mechanically and repetitively delivering blows before he passed the wooden stick to others. The 5 of them kept attacking and beating her until her whole body got distorted. They then stopped. No one thought she could survive, so they tossed the bodies to Braemar Hill and left. Based on Yin Sanlong's confession, the police accompanied him to the crime scene and indeed discovered the primary crime scene. There, the police found a significant amount of bloodstains and Nicholas' eyeball. As a result, the evidence of their 5-person involvement in the crime was conclusive. The trial for such an heinous crime took a long time. So back in 1985, they got arrested. But it wasn't until 1987 that they got their verdict. Zhao Weiwen, 25, and Tan Shihuan, 20, were found guilty as the main bad guys for 2 murders that were done in a really brutal way. The court sentenced them to death. But since Hong Kong didn't execute the death penalty anymore, the governor and the executive council changed their sentence to life in prison in 1992. At that point, they had already spent 7 years in jail. Usually people who do really bad things like they did would have to stay in prison for at least 30 years. One of them, Tan Shihuan, got cancer and passed away in prison in 2009. When the crime went down, Zhang Youheng and Yin Sanlong were both underage. 16 and 15 years old, respectively. So the judges couldn't give them the death penalty, according to Hong Kong's Criminal Procedure Ordinance. Instead, they had to wait for the Crown to make a decision. This waiting game lasted for years, like a lot of years. In fact, by the time 1997 rolled around, and Hong Kong was back in Chinese hands, it had already been 12 years since the crime was committed, and these two were still waiting for their sentence. With Hong Kong's handover, the old British laws were out the door, replaced by something called the Basic Law. If the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government had dragged their feet, these two could have been waiting even longer for their sentence. So basically, these guys had already been locked up for over 15 years, even without a verdict. And let's be real, both Hong Kong and the United Kingdom are domestic places, so they should be all about human rights, even for those who did bad things like them. So back in 1997, Zhang Youheng and Yin Sanlong started getting attention from the media, and there were lots of reports about them. But then a bunch of other stuff happened after Hong Kong was handed over to China, and the government was too busy to focus on their cases. And out of the blue, a letter arrived from the United Kingdom in the 1998. It was from the parents of the victims, Kenneth. They basically said that they'd forgiven the two young dudes who did it and wanted a quick trial for them. They even asked the court to go easy on Yin Sanlong, who had admitted he was involved. This letter caused a big fuss and led to a major trial in 1998. Zhang Youheng got sentenced to 35 years in prison, which was less than the other three adults, but still a long time to be locked up. He wasn't happy about his punishment, so he appealed. In 2006, the court took another look at his case and decided that he was just as guilty of abusing and killing two people as he was, and didn't feel bad about it at all. So the court thought the first punishment was just fine and didn't change a thing. Therefore, Zhang Youheng was stuck with the same sentence he got before. However, Yin Sanlong was also involved in the torture and killing of victims, but he got a little bit of a break because he seemed kind of sorry and behaved himself while he was in jail. In the end, Yin Sanlong got 27 years in jail, but he might be able to get out early if he keeps being good and didn't miss any holidays, which will be 1/3 of the time. So in 2004, after serving 19 years in jail, Yin Sanlong got released because he finished his sentence. He got out of jail when he was 35 years old. After the arrangement of the Correctional Services Department in Hong Kong, he took up a position at a law firm and started a new life. On the day of his release, many media reporters interviewed him. So back in the 98, while he was locked up, he heard about how the victim's family forgave him and even stood up for him. It totally changed his outlook on forgiveness and redemption. He was really glad that the harm he caused would never go away. Fast forward to September 2008, and Zhang Youheng was also released after serving his time. This case was all over the media, and they made it seem like it was done by some crazy kids. And let's be real, all three of the main bad guys were actually adults over 18 years old. So calling them a juvenile gang is a major exaggeration, though they were indeed immature the way they behaved, which was no excuse for them to kill. At first, I couldn't understand why Kenneth's father would forgive these minors, despite Yin Sanlong showing remorse and sorry when he was in prison. But then I realized it was a different law in Hong Kong. With the circumstances at the time, if Yin Sanlong didn't stand out to confess the crime, none of them would be convicted. Back in the 80s, DNA tag wasn't all that advanced yet. So the crazy thing is, even if they found semen and DNA on the victim's body, they couldn't use that as direct evidence to convict any of them. All they could do back then is determine blood types with blood and semen. No much else. If Yin Sanlong, or anyone for that matter, denied committing the crime and kept their mouth shut, they couldn't have been charged according to the laws at the time. Basically, without Yin Sanlong's confession, all the stories we tell would be only speculations from the police. There wouldn't be any factual evidence of the crime. Even if later on that DNA evidence could be used as the solid proof, they couldn't just track down those people again, you know? The case would be a mystery in that case. Additionally, Kenny's father may have seen Yin Sanlong as a child when he was only 15 when he committed the crime. So the dude was pretty young, and maybe he didn't fully understand what and how messed up his actions were. So although I was confused at first about Kenny's father's choice, but now that I think of it, I kinda see where he's coming from. Anyway, thanks for watching and hope to see you in my next video, aka subscribe. Bye. Hey, Divarian. Sorry, my cat kept rubbing her to my mic stick.